This episode is brought to you by Netflix. Jay Kelly, the new film from Academy Award nominee Noah Baumbach. George Clooney stars as an actor confronting his past and present on a journey of self-discovery, alongside Adam Sandler as his devoted manager. Critics are calling it a declaration of love to the chaotic art of filmmaking, with the Wall Street Journal praising it as a transcendent comedy drama. Jay Kelly is now playing only on Netflix.
Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 208 of Ben Franklin's World, a podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. This year, 2018, marks the 240th anniversary of the Franco-American Alliance. 240 years ago, France and the new United States forged a new friendship in two treaties, the Treaty of Alliance and the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. And the terms of this alliance meant that the French agreed to send the Americans much-needed supplies, soldiers, and ships for their fight against Great Britain. Now, although some Americans had hoped that the French would join them in their fight against Great Britain as early as 1775, the French didn't join the American war effort or even formally recognize the new United States until February 1778. Why the delay? The French wanted proof that the Americans were in this fight to win it. And they got that proof after October 17, 1777, the day John Burgoyne surrendered his British army at the Battle of Saratoga. Now, many historians consider the Battle of Saratoga to be the turning point in the American War for Independence. But National Book Award winner Nathaniel Philbrick disagrees. He sees two different turning points in the war, and both of those turning points came after that famed victory. And lucky for us, Nathaniel Philbrick has agreed to join us and tell us all about these turning points using details from two of his books, Valiant Ambition, George Washington, Benedict Arnold, and the Fate of the American Revolution, and In the Hurricane's Eye, The Genius of George Washington and the Victory at Yorktown. Now, as we explore the American Revolution and its turning points, Nat reveals the important role the sea has played in early American history and the American Revolution, details about the Battle of Saratoga, and why Nat sees both Benedict Arnold's act of treason and the French Navy's participation in the war effort as two turning points in the Americans' quest for independence. But first, have you followed Ben Franklin's World on Twitter yet? The podcast has a new Twitter handle, @BFWorldPodcast, and I'd love it if you do me the honor of a follow. I promise you, it will be totally worth it, because the Omohundro Institute's digital projects team and I are tweeting all sorts of great information about early American history, behind-the-scenes happenings here at the show. Plus, we're answering your questions, fielding your episode topic requests, and we may even start giving away books to those who tweet us. So follow @BFWorldPodcast and tweet us a hello. All right, are you ready to explore the American Revolution and its different turning points? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a National Book Award winner and a New York Times bestseller. He was born in Boston, grew up in Pittsburgh, and now lives on Nantucket. He's written 9 books, the two most recent of which are Valiant Ambition, George Washington, Benedict Arnold, and the Fate of the American Revolution, and In the Hurricane's Eye, The Genius of George Washington and the Victory at Yorktown. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Nathaniel Philbrick.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
Nat, we are so delighted to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, I'd like to start with your interest in the sea because that seems to be the common thread throughout most of the books you've written. So what is your interest in the sea, and how does it shape your view of past events like the American Revolution?
Yeah, I did grow up in that nautical center of the universe, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But in summers, we would spend a couple weeks with my grandparents on Cape Cod, and I developed an early love of sailing and raced competitively in my teenage and college years, and was actually a sailing journalist when we moved to Nantucket Island, where I became fascinated with the history of Nantucket, which was the whaling capital of the world, and wrote Away Offshore, my first work of history, and then In the Heart of the Sea and the others. And one of the things that just about every book kind of argues, sometimes secretly, is that, this is a nation that's been defined by a sense of wilderness. We usually think of that as the Western wilderness. But the fact of the matter is, in the early years of this country, it was the sea that was the wilderness that really defined the country. I mean, I wrote a book about Custer's Last Stand, and even that begins and ends with a riverboat on the Missouri River, because I really think whether it's the sea, the rivers, the lakes, Lake Champlain, for example, or Lake Erie, water is what was the essential element when it came to movement in America, particularly when it came to the American Revolution. And with my most recent, In the Hurricane's Eye, I really didn't fully appreciate how much the fact that this country is beside the Atlantic Ocean, how the Atlantic Ocean would ultimately be kind of the trump card that would be played when it came to the end of this long 8-year war.
And speaking of your new book, In the Hurricane's Eye, at the start of that book, you note that the War for Independence had really devolved into a stalemate between the British and the American armies by 1778. And you argue that this stalemate occurred because the Americans didn't have a big enough navy to protect their coast or to dislodge the British from cities like New York, and that the British Army didn't have enough men to adequately occupy or hold rebel territory. So I wonder if you would tell us more about these broad logistical challenges of the Revolution and why the War for Independence wasn't just a war of armies. I mean, why did there really need to be a naval component to ensure American victory?
Yeah, it really did come down to the land and the sea. Even though our army was not well organized, or in many cases as large as that of the British, which had some German mercenaries with them, obviously, it was too vast a land for the British to be able to occupy all that territory. So there was always a place for Washington's army, the American army, to hide out. And so there was no way for the British army to snuff out his army unless there would be some kind of climactic battle, which Washington was not going to let happen. But you have to remember that at this time, America was a coastal country. The 13 states were all right along the coastline. And this was before interstate highways. This was before railroads. And roads were terrible in America compared to Europe. And really the only effective way to transport armies with any kind of speed was by water. And since the British Navy was the most powerful on earth, that gave them an immediate advantage when it came to the sea. And if they could control that side of it, the water side of it, and America at this time did not have an effective navy when it came to fighting the British, it meant that it all came down to, as you mentioned, a standoff. And with the British occupying the sea and the Americans on the land.
Of course, the Americans weren't just on land, were they? In Valiant Ambition, you remind us that Benedict Arnold and the American Mosquito Fleet really attempted to hold important lakes and waterways for the Americans as well.
Yes, absolutely. This is where, for me, it becomes all the more fascinating. We had the sea, but there was also the lakes and rivers. And there was a corridor of water extending from New York at the base of the Hudson River. The Hudson goes straight north pretty much to Albany, is navigable all that way. And then soon after that, jogs to the right to Lake George. And at the end of Lake George, it jogs to the right to Lake Champlain, which is a lake of river-like dimensions that extends more than 100 miles into Canada, right to the St. Lawrence River. And this corridor of water determined so much. Whoever occupied that would have real logistical control in that area. And if the British could have gotten control of that whole thing, they could have cut off the New England states from the rest of the country, and that could have fatally crippled the American war effort. And so it's not just the sea, it's these rivers, it's these lakes. And I really think any analysis of the revolution has to take these into account because they had a profound impact on the course of the war and how it ultimately ended.
You know, while we're talking about Lake Champlain and the St. Lawrence and Hudson rivers, I wonder if we could also talk a bit about Saratoga. As you correctly point out in your books, American independence was not inevitable. And historians often try to prove this point by offering us different examples of turning points in the war so that we could see just how differently the war could have turned out. Now, Saratoga in 1777 happens to be one of their most popular turning points. Historians love to argue that the American victory in this campaign brought the French into the war and that it was ultimately the French that turned the tide of war to the Americans' favor. But what I found interesting about your books, Nat, is that while Saratoga is a popular turning point for historians, you offer us two very different turning points in your books, Valiant Ambition and In the Hurricane's Eye. In Valiant Ambition, you say that a major turning point in the war was Benedict Arnold's treason. And in The Hurricane's Eye, you note that the French Navy's participation in the war was really important between 1780 and 1781. Now, one thing these two turning points have in common is Benedict Arnold. So, would you tell us a bit about Arnold and his actions during the Saratoga campaign?
Well, Arnold was one of these people who immediately had a real strategic sense from the very beginning of the war. He was the one who realized that, we did need control of Fort Ticonderoga at the southern end of Lake Champlain if we were going to control this corridor of water. And so he and Ethan Allen would take that. And so he was very aware of this. And then a year before the Battle of Saratoga, he had fought the British in a naval battle, the Battle of Valcour Island on Lake Champlain, just below Plattsburgh, which would really set up what would happen a year later at Saratoga. So you can see that confrontation at Saratoga was something that Benedict Arnold's actions in the year preceding it had a lot to do with it becoming that central battle. Of course, the Americans would win it. Yes, it was a great military victory, but it was almost as much a question of logistics. The British found it really impossible to maintain a supply line all the way into Canada, and were starving to death by the time they crossed the Hudson and were knocking on the door of Albany. And if they could have linked up with Howe and the rest of the British Army in New York, that would have done it. But Arnold and Horatio Gates would defeat the British, and that was a great momentous victory. It contributed to the fact that the French would come in, but as would be proven, that didn't necessarily mean victory was within reach. It would take a number of years after that before victory would happen. A lot of other things had to happen. And so I think, people who look to the Battle of Saratoga as the great turning point, it's really a kind of prelude. It's the beginning of a process that would take 3 years to unfold, in which the French would enter the war, but it would take several years and a lot of heartburn on the behalf of George Washington in trying to get it to a point where the French Navy could actually help the Continental Army.
You just mentioned that the Battle of Valcour Island in 1776 really laid the groundwork for the Battle of Saratoga. And the Battle of Valcour Island is really not a battle we hear very often or at all about. So would you tell us about this battle and how it laid the groundwork for Saratoga?
Yeah, I think it's one of the great, largely unknown naval battles in American history, if not beyond. I grew up racing a sunfish on Lake Champlain, so it was a body of water which I knew something about. As I described earlier, Lake Champlain is this river-like body of water extending up to Canada. And Arnold knew there was a huge British invasionary force that had been assembled at the northern part of Lake Champlain. And Arnold knew they needed a northerly breeze to come down the river towards Fort Ticonderoga and attempt to take that. And he also knew that the fleet he had assembled that summer, building a fleet of about 15 vessels, could not face the British fleet on the open lake. They would just get shot to pieces. So he came up with a plan of hiding his fleet inside Valcour Island on what's now the New York side of Lake Champlain, inside the island at the mouth of Valcour Bay. Wait until the British sailed past Valcour Island. About 2 miles past, he basically stuck out his head and waved his hand and said, "Come and get me." And this meant that the British now had to sail upwind, and their most powerful warships were square-rigged and could not effectively sail against the wind. And so Arnold had come up with a way to negate the most powerful element of the British fleet. And he would ultimately fight them to a draw in a very dramatic standoff at the edge of Valcour Bay, and managed to escape that night and make his way towards Fort Ticonderoga. And so it wasn't necessarily an American victory, but the fact that he was able to fight them to a draw was remarkable. And it was such a level of resistance that the British Commander Carleton began to say, it's getting late. We're already late October by the time they had made their way down the lake to Fort Ticonderoga. Lake Champlain begins to freeze in November. Maybe we should postpone this to next year. And so he made the remarkable decision to retreat back into Canada. And this is really important stuff. This saved America in 1776. And it was Arnold's doing, and it set up, as I said earlier, what happened a year later at Saratoga.
You know, this is really what I see as a recurring tactic for the Americans throughout the war. They can't claim victory for most of their encounters with the British, but they often really stymied grander British plans and stopped them from advancing. And I think you can see this in one of my favorite examples, which is in June 1775 at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Americans can't claim that as a victory, and yet they can because they really stymied the British for the rest of the year.
Absolutely. You know, as Nathaniel Greene said after the Battle of Bunker Hill, if we could lose another hill to the British like this, we could win the war. The British had several Pyrrhic victories that did nothing to help them militarily and did a lot to energize the Americans, who were rightly amazed at holding them off. You know, and this is all they had to do because of the vastness of America and the fact that the British could not occupy all of it. If the Americans could play the game of rope-a-dope, to use a boxing metaphor, and just sort of hold them off without suffering that climactic defeat that could end it, they could just hang in there, suffering minor defeat after minor defeat. They had a possibility of seeing this to the end.
Now, when you described the Saratoga campaign for us, you didn't really sound that impressed. So I wonder if you would tell us what you make of the battle.
It's a remarkable victory, and it's remarkable how many New England militiamen came out of the woods to participate. But, you know, it was a situation in which the British were basically floundering in the wilderness, and the Americans finally had the ability to rally enough people together and basically swarm over them. And so, yes, it was a great victory, and it was an embarrassment to the British, and was a contributing factor to the French coming in, but it didn't win the war for us by any means.
Okay, now that we've explored Saratoga, let's explore some of the turning points Nat sees in the war. One of the turning points that you see, Nat, is Benedict Arnold's treason. And it does really seem like Arnold was never quite the same after the Battle of Saratoga. So would you tell us about the wound Arnold received during the fighting in that battle, and how and if that wound impacted his outlook on the war?
Yeah, he had already been injured at Quebec when a musket ball ricocheted and hit his left leg. And that same left leg was shattered by a musket ball towards the end of the climactic Battle of Bemis Heights at Saratoga. And his horse then collapsed on top of that, shattering a bone of that leg. And it would be 4 months. He would lay in a hospital bed, the pieces of his leg stuffed into what they called a fracture box. And the leg would be 2 inches shorter than the other one when he finally emerged. And Arnold was someone for whom his athleticism was just a part of who he was. One person remarked that he was one of the finest athletes he had ever seen. And after this, all of that was changed. The Continental Congress had been slow to give Arnold the promotion he felt he deserved, and bitterness inevitably entered in. They had also been slowed in paying the costs he had fronted earlier in the war. And all these things, he brooded, and he would emerge from that experience a different man.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it sounds like he was broke, injured, and possibly even broken after this experience.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we are very aware today of the effects of battle and injury to people's mental state. But back then, that really wasn't something that people were focusing on. And I think Arnold emerged from this experience a changed man and a bitter man. Okay, I've given this much for a country that does not seem to acknowledge what it's involved for me. Now I'm on my own. And a lot of his personal fortune had been spent in his military efforts. And so he began to really look out for himself and take a very different attitude.
Of course, it did seem like Arnold had an advantage that a lot of soldiers in his position didn't have. I mean, Arnold really wasn't the only one who was disappointed when the Continental Congress passed him over for a promotion he thought he deserved. I mean, I'm thinking right now of John Stark of New Hampshire, who was so fed up he just quit the army. But Arnold had the advantage of George Washington's favor. And it did seem like Washington tried to take care of Arnold by placing him in command of Philadelphia in 1778 while he recovered from his wound.
Absolutely. And Arnold could not walk unassisted at this point. It would be another year before he could ride a horse. He was not able to participate in an active command. And because of the Battle of Saratoga and the entry of France into the war, the British were forced to consolidate their army in New York and evacuate Philadelphia, which they had just won from Washington that fall and winter before. And Philadelphia was in chaos and needed a military governor. And so Washington appointed Arnold to do it, since it did not require any great athletic endeavor. And Philadelphia at this time was a cauldron of anger. The patriots who had returned after the British occupation were very angry with the loyalist-leaning populace that had remained in Philadelphia. It would have taken a general of immense tact and patience to deal with this situation. And this was not Arnold. Arnold was tempestuous, thin-skinned, and at this point, looking out for himself and interested in any kind of shady business deal that might enrich himself. And so it was a recipe for disaster, and Washington was kind of the unwitting accomplice when it came to creating this really toxic situation.
How exactly was Arnold's command in Philadelphia a recipe for disaster? Was it his time in Philadelphia that led Arnold to commit treason?
It was certainly a contributing factor. One of the personalities in Philadelphia politics was Joseph Reed, the young Philadelphia lawyer who had served as Washington's adjutant general in New York in 1776, but was now serving in Pennsylvania government. He was the equivalent of what we would call governor. He was the head of the executive committee of the legislative body, and he was what we would call a radical, and Arnold was on the more conservative side, and the two men despised one another. And Reed did everything he could to bring charges against Arnold, and Arnold was doing some off-the-book things that were highly suspicious, although Reed really didn't have any evidence. And anyways, it just got really ugly. This once again contributed, I think, to the skepticism that Arnold had when it came to America's ability to win this thing. The fact of the matter is, America had enjoyed a lot of liberty and freedom under the British. And ever since the war, particularly in Philadelphia, those freedoms were hard to find. And so he began to question this. And another contributing factor was that Arnold was a widower and 36 years old. And he met Peggy Shippen, an 18-year-old woman who came from aristocracy of Philadelphia, who had greatly enjoyed the winter of the British occupation, where she had socialized with Major John Andre, who would become the British spy chief, and they get married. And this lays the groundwork, I think, for what is to come.
So when we do talk about Benedict Arnold as a traitor, what are we really talking about? I mean, he seems to have grown disenchanted with the United States, but what was his act of treason?
There are several, what we could call them, little acts of treason. And it began by him sending out basically a feeler letter to Andre, and Arnold included some vital information about the American army. So that's an act of treason. And then the British didn't pay him the attention he felt he was due. He sort of cut off the correspondence, and then things really got bad in Philadelphia. There was basically a riot and a battle in which Arnold was involved, and it just was not going well for him. And at the urging of his wife, Peggy, the correspondence was resumed. And then Arnold realized that he could make some money out of this, that the British paid him a certain amount of money to accomplish a specific goal. This could really work for him. And so he realized that if he could become commander at West Point, which was now America's foremost fortress, it was once again on that corridor of water, 3,000 soldiers stationed there, all sorts of ammunition and artillery. And if this should fall into the hands of the British, it could be disastrous, particularly because by this time it's the summer of 1780. The American war effort has cratered. The American people are just not coming up with the funds required to win themselves the independence they have set out to get, and Washington's army is withering on the vine. Arnold would later say he was convinced there's just no way America was going to win the war, and he would claim that he saw by surrendering West Point to the British, he might effect a fairly bloodless turn of events that would bring the revolution to an end and bring the restoration of British liberties to America. That's how he saw it, but of course it would turn out very differently.
Did Arnold actually surrender West Point, or was his act of treason more of an attempt?
You know, you can't make this stuff up. The British were all set to go through with it. They had troops loaded into ships in New York. The plan was to sail up the Hudson River and attack West Point, which with Arnold's help would quickly fall. But before they could go through with that, they needed to have a face-to-face meeting with Arnold because this had all been done through cloak and dagger correspondence, and they weren't even sure they were talking really to Arnold. Who knew? They just needed a face-to-face. And so decision was made. Ultimately, Major John Andre would sail up the Hudson River on the most appropriately named British vessel ever, the HMS Vulture, and would meet with Arnold on the west bank of the Hudson at midnight, during which Arnold would turn over some documents related to the security of West Point. And the plan was for then Andre to be rowed back to the Vulture, sail back to New York, and then the attack would begin. But the next morning, an American officer, unknown to Arnold, would lug some cannon down to the end of Teller's Point and fire on the Vulture, forcing her down the river. This meant that Andre had lost his way back to New York. He would wait till nightfall and under disguise cross the river and make his way through Westchester, which was then known as the neutral ground because it was this sort of DMZ between British-occupied New York and the American army to the north. And he would be captured by 3 American militiamen who would discover the documents that Arnold had given him. And they knew that Andre was a spy, but they weren't sure how he had gotten those documents. They had their suspicions about Arnold, but there was not yet the proof from their point of view. And so a letter went to Arnold and a letter went to George Washington, who was at this time on his way to Arnold's headquarters a mile below West Point for a tour of West Point after having met up with French General Rochambeau in Hartford. Arnold would get the letter just hours before Washington would, informing him that Andre had been captured. Arnold would then leap into his barge and order the oarsmen to row him down the river. He would ultimately board the Vulture and make his way to British-occupied New York. Soon afterwards, Washington arrives, realizes what's happened, and turns to Lafayette and says, "Whom can we trust now?"
Now, in Valiant Ambition, you make the case that Arnold's act of treason was truly a turning point of the war. Would you tell us why you think that's the case?
And this is the great tragic irony of Arnold's life. He was one of our best generals at the beginning of the war, but it was his act of treason that sent a real lightning bolt through America. When news of Arnold's treason made its way up and down the eastern seaboard, he was burned in effigy in town after town. Talk about a wake-up call. And the British would actually play into this because Arnold would become a British brigadier general and be sent to Virginia. And Washington would send Lafayette in pursuit, and thus would begin the movement of troops that in just a year's time after Arnold's treason would result in the great victory at Yorktown. And I think Arnold's treason is the beginning of this, incredible process. So I think, yes, the Battle of Saratoga was an important point, but Arnold's treason set into motion what would ultimately be the movement of troops that would lead to a victory at Yorktown.
And this movement of troops to the south led to a second turning point that Nat sees in the war, which is the participation of the French Navy in the war effort. Nat, prior to the Yorktown campaign, what exactly was the role of the French Navy in the American war effort?
Yeah, it had been a source of huge frustration for Washington. Washington had an amazing strategic sense, not only when it came to battles on land, but when it came to the sea, because what he recognized was the only way he was going to win the victory that might win American independence was with the help of the French Navy. And so as soon as he knew the alliance was a reality, he worked as hard as he could to coordinate his efforts with that of the French Navy and create what was known as naval superiority, a portion of the Atlantic seaboard where, with operating in coordination with the French Navy, he could win the victory that would do it for them. And so the French Navy initially set out from France with all sorts of high hopes in 1778 under Admiral d'Estaing. They sailed up, and the plan was to trap the British Navy, which was then in the Delaware, loading up the British Army. And if they had gotten to the mouth of the Delaware in any kind of time, that would have happened. But they had one of the longest crossings ever recorded. the British were able to slip out of the Delaware into New York. And then the French, it was their next thing to try to cross the bar at Sandy Hook and attack the British, and it was a small British Navy at New York. But D'Estaing determined that the sandbar at Sandy Hook was too much of an obstacle for his ships and declined the opportunity to take on the British in New York Harbor. And so he then headed up towards Newport, which had been recently taken by the British. And this was the third chance to deliver a decisive blow in 1778. Admiral Howe, brother to William the General, sailed his small fleet in pursuit to Newport, and the showdown was about to happen when a storm, almost equivalent to a hurricane, rocked both fleets, and the battle never happened. And D'Estaing, rather than returning to Newport, decided he needed to go to Boston for repairs, leaving the American army that was about to attack Newport in the lurch. And so it all came to nothing. And then for the next 2 years, Washington would plead with the French, let's get the Navy up from the Caribbean, because the Caribbean was what was known as the West Indies, was of most interest to both the British and the French. The Sugar Islands of the Caribbean were worth much more to both nations than North America. And so that's where their general interest was. And that's where the French Navy spent most of its time. But it was the hurricane season that would hopefully bring some of the ships up the eastern seaboard. And Washington worked feverishly to try to get a sizable French fleet on the eastern seaboard. And after 3 years of trying, by the fall of 1780, Washington was truly in despair.
Do we know anything about the motivations of the French? Because it sounds like the Comte d'Estaing could have attacked when he didn't attack, that he was actually really hesitant to engage on the behalf of the Americans. So I wonder, did the French respect the Americans as a fighting force?
I think there's a tendency to see the French-American Alliance as this ideal partnership because it ultimately led to our victory, but it was not easy. And the French did not have a very high regard for the American soldiers. And they also had, quite rightly, deep suspicions that, the American people did not have the wherewithal to see this thing to the end. The French high command was very fearful that they would just be deserted by the Americans and forced to get out of North America. And the French had their own agenda. They had joined the war not necessarily to help America, although that was one of the aims. They did it to put a hurt into Britain because Britain had humiliated them by the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, and they saw this as a chance to win back a lot of what they had lost since then. And so they had their own agenda, an agenda that did not always fit with Washington's. And so it was very frustrating for Washington. At one point, he, in a lamenting letter, says, it's almost as if a chasm has formed between me and the French Navy in the West Indies, that there's just so little communication. And it just drove him crazy to know that the Navy that could win him this war was down there, but just was not available to him.
Now, when we were talking about Benedict Arnold's treason, Nat noted that before Washington arrived at West Point, he had attended a meeting with Rochambeau near Hartford, Connecticut. And it was at that meeting where Washington and Rochambeau planned the Yorktown campaign. And after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, we'll talk about this meeting because Chris and Tumek have a question about it. You may recall that at the start of our conversation with Nat, he mentioned just how important the Franco-American Alliance was in the revolutionaries' quest for independence. The Americans really could control more physical territory than the British Army, but they couldn't control the sea without the help of the French Navy. Of course, to really coordinate strategy during the Franco-American Alliance, both the Americans and the French needed to communicate with each other, which means both sides needed translators on their respective staffs who could speak, read, and write English and French. In fact, one of the French translators George Washington employed on his staff was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton grew up in the Caribbean and likely learned French as a child. Of course, you don't have to grow up and immerse yourself in a foreign culture to learn a new language. You could just use Babbel, the #1 selling language learning app in the world. Babbel offers 10 to 15-minute lessons in many different languages that you can take anytime, anywhere, on your desktop, smartphone, or tablet, and regardless of what device you use, your progress is synced across them, so you can always pick up right where you left off. Now, Babbel offers lessons in many different languages, like Spanish, French, Italian, German, Swedish, and many more. Plus, Babbel can help you speak your new language within just a few weeks. And right now, you can try Babbel for free. Go to Babbel.com or download the app and try it for free. That's Babbel, Babbel.com, or download the app and try it for free. Babbel.com. Nat, Chris and Tumek would like to know more about Washington's involvement in the planning of the Yorktown campaign, because they've read that Washington really wanted to attack New York City, but it was the French who insisted that they move south. So would you tell us more about how Washington and Rochambeau planned Yorktown?
Yeah, actually, there were two meetings. The first meeting that preceded Arnold's treason was in Hartford in 1780, and that had very broad aims. And then it wouldn't be until the spring of 1781 where there would be the fateful meeting. It would actually be in Wethersfield, Connecticut, because the Connecticut legislature was meeting in Hartford and there was no room for them. So they met in Wethersfield, and the French were very skeptical that it was possible to take New York because the British were so dug in there. They had had years to dig in. There was a significant British Navy in the harbor, and it would be very difficult for the French to get across the bar, defeat the British Navy, and dislodge the British, since one of the rules of a siege is you have to have at least twice the number of soldiers as the army you're trying to take. And the Americans were not coming up with a lot of soldiers. And so Rochambeau kept saying, well, why don't we go to the Chesapeake? Look what Arnold's doing down there. Maybe that's what we should be doing. But what Washington realized at that point, Cornwallis was still down in North Carolina. There was a fairly small British army in Virginia. If that was going to be a success, it wouldn't necessarily be a game changer when it came to this conflict. And in New York, there were more than 10,000 British soldiers. If they could win that, that would definitely change the game. I think personally, the scene of some of Washington's greatest military embarrassments were in New York, and this would have been a way to sort of clear the board of all that. And so Washington was for New York, and the French kept pushing for the Chesapeake. But one of the things Washington pointed out was that if they were going to go for the Chesapeake, they'd have to get the French and American armies, the French were then at that point in Newport, but would later join up with the American army outside New York. They would have to get the army all the way down to Virginia and in summer. And this was crazy to attempt to do that, particularly if they were going to do it overland, because the small French Navy at Newport, the commander had said he didn't have enough ships to transport soldiers down. And so Washington, quite rightly, was skeptical of the ability of a campaign to work in the Chesapeake and kept pushing for New York. And so they were at cross purposes. And unknown to Washington, Rochambeau would sort of behind Washington's back write to Admiral de Grasse, who was the head of the French Navy down in the Caribbean, that, Washington prefers New York, but I prefer the Chesapeake. What do you think's the best thing? And it was to no surprise, de Grasse would elect ultimately to go for the Chesapeake.
So this is how it happened. Rochambeau was the one who ultimately closed the chasm that Washington had felt between him and the French Navy.
Yeah, but the chasm was closed, but from Washington's point of view, in an infuriating way, because, technically he was the commander-in-chief of the Allied Army. Earlier in that winter, there had been a sea battle in the Chesapeake, and this is a relatively little-known battle, the Battle of Cape Henry. It was in March of 1781 in response to Benedict Arnold's appearance in the Chesapeake that winter. He marched up the James River, burned Richmond, and had Virginia in bedlam. Washington sent Lafayette down there and a small army and pleaded with the French to send what small number of ships they had in Newport immediately down to the Chesapeake and in a combined force take Benedict Arnold. And what this is almost an exact dress rehearsal for what would ultimately become involving Cornwallis. And the French had sort of worked at cross purposes with Washington then, and it had been a very frustrating endeavor that had ultimately failed. And so by the time of his conference with Rochambeau later in the spring, he was highly skeptical and frustrated with the French. And yet ultimately, it would be Rochambeau who would encourage de Grasse to come up, and it would work. But it was, once again, not as Washington would have liked or anticipated, but such as Washington would philosophically reflect later in the war effort, such as life.
Now, on the 5th of September, 1781, the French fleet did arrive in the Chesapeake, and it finally engaged the British fleet at the Battle of Virginia Capes also known as the Battle of the Chesapeake. Nat, would you tell us about this battle and how it relates to the Siege of Yorktown?
Yeah, we look to Yorktown as the main event, the siege that won us the revolution, but actually it was the naval battle that created the circumstances that made it happen. And it's a remarkable battle. Some people have argued it's the most important naval battle in the history of the world. That may be an overstatement, but it's remarkable in that Washington had been trying to coordinate his army with the French Navy. But finally, the French Navy decides, okay, we're going to send not only a large force, but a really large force up the Atlantic seaboard to the Chesapeake. And a fleet of almost 30 warships sails into the Chesapeake, soon has Cornwallis, who is, for reasons that still confound us, had elected to remain at the end of the lonely point at Yorktown and was now basically surrounded because finally we'd established naval superiority with the French Navy. But then just a few days after de Grasse's arrival comes the British fleet, not as large as de Grasse, but a sizable fleet, sailing down from New York, where the Caribbean fleet had combined with the forces already there. And they would meet on September 5th. De Grasse's fleet was anchored at the entrance of the Chesapeake Bay. Once the tide started going out, sailed out and met the approaching British fleet. Was kind of an ugly strategic tactical battle from the French side in that their line of battle was very disorganized and coming out because in his haste, de Grasse ordered a ligne de vitesse, meaning that he would assemble his fleet not in the usual order, but in the order of the speed of the ships. And so the fastest ships out would be the first in line, and thus it would go. And the line was ragged with more than mile-long gaps in it. But thanks to the bravery of the French vanguard, the handful of ships in the front of the French fleet, they would be able to battle the British to an effective draw, basically, but inflict such injuries and damage to the ships that British Admiral Graves would decide he needed to go back to New York for repairs. And after many days of hesitation and arguing with his officers, would head back to New York, and thus leaving de Grasse with the ability to return to the Chesapeake. By this time, Washington and Rochambeau were arriving. Their armies would soon follow them. And thus this naval battle, in which not a single American ship was involved, made the siege at Yorktown almost a virtual fait accompli. And so I think it's important. It was not just a mere warm-up for Yorktown. It was really, in many ways, the central element in winning the victory that would ultimately win the war.
And of course, Cornwallis would surrender at the end of the Siege of Yorktown. And it really does seem like if the French fleet hadn't been there and engaged with the British at the Battle of Virginia Capes, that this siege could have turned out very differently.
Yes. If the French hadn't been there, for one thing, the American army could not have existed down there. You needed a water transportation to effectively feed an army of that size. And so whoever commanded the waters of the Chesapeake commanded the Chesapeake. And so it wouldn't have happened if the French Navy hadn't been there, because the British Navy would have been there and Cornwallis would have had a way to escape. And, as soon as de Grasse arrived, Cornwallis could have gotten out of Yorktown and headed into North Carolina and made his way to Charleston. And Washington and Rochambeau would have arrived and there would have been no one to surround. But for reasons we're still debating, Cornwallis remained. He would later say that the promises that British Commander Clinton in New York made of saving him made him remain. But the fact is, this never would have worked without the cooperation, if you will, of Cornwallis, who watched all of this happen around him and resolved to stay, enabling us to win that victory that changed history.
Now, one of the common themes in both of Nat's books, Valiant Ambition and In the Hurricane's Eye, is Nat's desire to show us examples of contingencies in history. For example, in the Hurricane's Eye, Nat shows us that there were a lot of events outside of human control that just had to happen for the battle and siege at Yorktown to end with the Franco-American success. Nat, would you tell us about contingency and its role in history, and why you make such a point to illustrate it for your readers?
Well, it's so easy in hindsight to look back and see a string of events as almost fated. So they did this so that this would happen and that would happen. And that's just not the way things work, particularly in the 18th century when ships relied on wind communications were signal flags, no radios. So many things could happen that were outside of anyone's control that it could so easily have gone the other way. The French would look back and say, how myopic and stubborn Washington was for wrongly insisting on New York. But the Chesapeake campaign worked. Cornwallis had to stay where he was, and no one thought he would do that, but he did. Okay, so that worked. Then there were so many other things that had to happen. There were so many messages from the British West Indies that never made it to New York in time. The French had run out of money in the West Indies and ultimately relied on a loan of a huge amount of money from the Spanish, their allies in Cuba. And so a Cuban loan was a requirement of all this. So much of this had to happen, and it was all out of any one person's control. And so one of the fascinating things about this story, and Washington would look back and say, it's a miracle this happened. But I think it's wrong to say, this person had it figured out, because no one had it figured out. But Washington was the one person who saw the strategy that would win this and worked as hard as he could, given the knowledge he had, to make that strategy work. And one of the great things about Washington was his ability to shift gears. When he learned that, no, the French aren't going to New York, they're going to the Chesapeake, he was angry because he had hoped that they would first come to New York and load up his army onto the ships and sail them down. That would have made complete sense. But instead, they went to the Chesapeake, and so that forced him to march his army all the way overland down to the Chesapeake. But he shifted gears and embraced that plan with ultimate enthusiasm and efficiency, and he made it happen. For me, it's a miracle it happened, and it's fascinating to watch how many times it could have gone a completely different way. And I think it just, as Americans looking at our past, I think it's important to realize, this was not ordained in any fashion. It was a series of events that occurred in exactly the way they occurred, but could have gone so many other ways.
Let's move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Now, in Valiant Ambition, Nat notes that Benedict Arnold had asked Washington a couple of times for a naval commission. So Nat, in your opinion, what might have happened if George Washington had recommended Benedict Arnold for a command and commission in the fledgling United States Navy? How would the American War for Independence have been different? And would the Americans have needed the French fleet?
That's a great question. Well, I think this is one of the great what-ifs of at least the Revolutionary War history. Arnold had all the makings of a crackerjack admiral. I mean, he had shown at Valcour Island, he understood strategy and tactics. He could act with decisiveness. He was an experienced mariner. He wanted to be in the Navy. And, yes, he had this lust for money, but so many British admirals had exactly the same thing. This was what being a naval officer was kind of all about. And so if Arnold had become a naval officer, I think he would have been the John Paul Jones times 10, perhaps. I mean, the problem was that we didn't have really an effective Navy. Navies are extremely expensive and require a lot of infrastructure to create. We had just been created by a revolution. So there was no way we could build a Navy that could compete against that of Britain. And so we needed the French and also, by the way, Spain. Their ships did not participate in the Battle of the Chesapeake, but the fact that all those French ships were able to come up the seaboard was based on the fact that the Spanish were holding down the fort in the West Indies. So that I think Arnold could have been very effective there. He had all sorts of plans for sailing to Bermuda and citing a slave rebellion, all this kind of stuff that who knows what he might have come up with. But it is one of the great what ifs. And in any event, I would guess he would not have turned traitor and might have been both a hero on land and sea.
So over the last 5 years, Nat, you've really taken us through the military aspects of the American Revolution, from Bunker Hill now through Yorktown. So what aspect of history will you be researching and writing about now?
Well, I need a shift of gears. I've been so long into the American Revolution, and this has been unusual for me. Usually each book I take on an entirely different topic. But this has been really fun. And I have to say, I never thought it would happen, but I've become absolutely fascinated with Washington. I want to move on. I want to shift gears, but I'm also, what's going to happen to Washington? So one of the things that I've always wanted to do, I love when I'm working on a book, I love the research trips, going to the places, checking things out. And so I really wanted to base a book on a research project. So I'm going to work on a travel log, actually with my wife and our dog, Dora, and follow Washington. Because after the revolution, ultimately he would become president, head out and realize that he was the president of 13 very non-united states. It wasn't political parties yet, but each state saw itself as its own little independent entity, and there was really no sense of national solidarity. So Washington decided he needed to go out on a road trip and visit all 13 states. And so I'm going to follow Washington on that journey. It'll be part travelogue, part history. Washington, at the conclusion of the revolution, returned to Mount Vernon, failed retirement, and became infatuated with the concept of using the Potomac to unite the West with the East. Once again, the rivers are everything. If he could find a way to connect the headwaters of the Potomac with a river flowing west into the Monongahela River and then the Ohio River, he would find an important economic link that would keep America's Western future tied to the Eastern present. And so he embarked within just 9 months of his return to Mount Vernon on a road trip up the Potomac that would also take him to the lands he owned south of Pittsburgh. And I grew up, as I said earlier, in Pittsburgh. So my wife and I have already set out on what's going to be a year-long road trip following Washington. It's going to be called Travels with George, in search of Washington's America.
That sounds like such a fun trip. Is there a place online where we can follow along with you as you travel, or even find your contact information if we have more questions about the revolution?
Yes, I've got a website, nathanielphilbrick.com, and you can email me through that site. I'm also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I have already been filing reports from the road, and I really enjoy getting feedback from readers and getting a chance to talk with them. And so I'm enjoying heading out on the road in October when In the Hurricane's Eye hits bookstores.
Nathaniel Philbrick, thank you so much for joining us and for helping us consider the role water played in the American Revolution and a couple of different turning points in the war.
Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
The victory at Yorktown was not predestined or preordained. As Nat revealed, a lot of events that were often independent of each other had to line up as they did, or the siege at Yorktown would have ended quite differently. And for Nat, the events that needed to line up began lining up after the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777. Benedict Arnold received such a serious leg wound in that battle that doctors wanted to amputate. Arnold flatly refused, and so he began a long and very dangerous process of healing. And this long process left him embittered, especially when news reached him that the Continental Congress had passed him over for promotion. Arnold had sacrificed his fortune and his health to the American cause, and what did he have to show for it? Thinking along these lines led him to contact Major John André and the British forces to see if they were interested in buying his information and his loyalty. Of course, Arnold's attempt to hand over West Point failed, but his quest to pay Americans back for their disrespect brought him more success. Arnold took a British force and wreaked havoc in Virginia between January and May 1781. The havoc Arnold caused prompted Rochambeau and Washington to turn their attention from New York City to Virginia, and thus they marched toward Yorktown in August. Now, as Nat noted, we really do look upon the Siege of Yorktown as a main event that ended major military conflict between the United States and Great Britain. But in reality, we really should look at the siege in conjunction with the French naval victory at the Battle of Virginia Capes. That battle took place just before the siege commenced, and because it ended with the British fleet needing to return to New York for repairs, Cornwallis and his men found themselves alone, with their backs to the sea and the French and American forces right before them. With no way out and limited supplies, Cornwallis surrendered. Now, Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown prompted the British to seek peace with the Americans, and not because the British thought they couldn't defeat the Americans, but because they no longer wanted to. The war had gone on for 7 long years, and it cost them a lot of money. Plus now, Great Britain needed to defend its possessions in Europe, the Caribbean, and India against French and Spanish incursions. So the British made a calculation and decided it was better to protect these more lucrative parts of their empire than it was to try and subdue the rebellious Americans. And that's how the United States secured its independence. It survived and outlasted the British will to fight for it. Look for more information about Nat, his books, Valiant Ambition, and In the Hurricane's Eye, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/208. Whether you need to coordinate with the French or pick up a few useful phrases for your upcoming trip to a foreign country, Babbel can help you out. And right now, you can try the .1 language learning app in the world for free when you visit Babbel.com or download their app. That's Babbel, BABBEL.com, or download the app and try it for free. Babbel.com. Hello, Seattle. I'm coming your way in early December, and if you live in the area or you'll be visiting there too, I'd love to meet up with you on the afternoon of Saturday, December 1st. Now, I've only visited Seattle once. I have really great memories of that city, but it was over a decade ago, so I have no idea where we're going to meet up. So if you live in the area and you'd love to meet up, please drop me a line, and please tell me where you think we should meet up. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Holly White assisted with the production of this episode. Thanks for your help, Holly. Finally, what do you think? Do you think Saratoga is a turning point of the revolution? Do you think one of the points that Nat told us about makes more sense? I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here, and I'm just curious what you think. So tell me, Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.